When you see that you can make a sente exchange, then the first thing to look at is whether you have more ways of using the weakness in your opponent's shape. If there is only one way, then it is alright to make the sente exchange. So how to recognize such situations? Well, if you can force your opponent into a clearly bad shape like an empty triangle or a dumpling, then it is usually alright to just play the exchange and destroy their shape. Here are 3 common examples of such situations. Look at this position. Black approaches white's corner, white plays the attachment, and this joseki follows. White plays the tiger's mouth, and here black has a chance to play an atari against the tiger's mouth, and black should do it without thinking. After this move, white is forced into an empty triangle. Later black can choose whether to connect this stone or that stone, but for now, certainly the exchange is good. And here is another type of such situations, also involving a tiger's mouth, but this time you can peep against it. Black is very strong and there is no possibility to atari against the tiger's mouth, but white can play this peep for free. Black is forced to answer, and again black ends up with an empty triangle. So once again, white can play this exchange without thinking. And now the third type of position. What to do after your opponent plays a double hane. In this joseki, white plays a double hane against black stones, and technically there are 2 ways in which black can use white's weaknesses. Black can cut here or cut there. However, it is this cut that forces white into a bad shape, an empty triangle, and cuts off a single stone in the center. This is the joseki, and in the joseki the next move is an extension here. White follows by pushing, and then white captures this stone of black, and black also stabilizes their shape. You might feel somewhat bad that you have just inserted that exchange and now your stone dies captured in a ladder, but here goes a very important proverb. Don't save the kikashi stones. We will go back to this proverb many times in this course, and by the way, kikashi is just the Japanese way of saying a forcing move. Looking back at the position, this stone has already served its purpose. It forced white into an empty triangle and created a weakness in white's shape, so it is completely fine to let it be captured now. But by the way, what if black decides to save the stone? So at this point, instead of playing the joseki move, black extends the stone. What should be the next move of white? What should white play without any thinking? So here is the pattern that you really need to learn recognizing. You can play an atari against the tiger's mouth, forcing your opponent into the empty triangle. It's a good exchange, you get it for free, and later you think what to play next. And by the way, in one of the next lessons I will tell you that when you want to play a sente exchange, you plan first your next move. So it will be contradictory, but don't worry. So once again, here are the 3 types of positions: an atari against the tiger's mouth, a peep on the tiger's mouth, and the atari after a double hane. Here comes a very practical example of a 3-3 invasion under a corner enclosure. Black invades, white blocks, and at this point, what should be the next move of black? So obviously, as Vadim showed you in his course about the basic mistakes, your stone on the second line is threatened, so you connect solidly, and then your group is just completely dead. Bye-bye! What does black do here seriously? The black's group is in danger of dying, so an active way of trying to live would be to play hane on this side, connect, white would also connect, and black makes life, but it's not really the most satisfactory way to do it. Don't forget about one thing that you should have done before, without any thinking. Before playing the first hane, you could make this exchange, and this should be a no-brainer for you. You cut your opponent's shape, force white into a bad shape, empty triangle, and then you follow with a hane, solid connect, and another solid connect. See the difference? Here, white's shape is still cut, and white needs to somehow take care of that, capturing black's stone, so black finishes up in sente. But in the other variation, white was already all connected with a good shape. And once again, we don't care about the kikashi stone. It already served its purpose. It destroyed white's shape and let us finish the position in sente. And what are the positions in which you have more ways of using a weakness? Let's start with the most basic, abstract example, a one-space jump. Black can peep against it, forcing white to connect. But it is also possible to peep from the other side. So which of the two should black choose? Well, it's best to not choose any, to keep both options open. Don't burn your bridges.
Stash, but I saw that professional players sometimes peep against this shape.
Well, the peep can sometimes be a good move, but generally you want to keep the options open as long as possible. And at one point there comes a moment when you need to choose because you may be needed on a specific side. We will talk more about this in the later examples in this course. How do you know that there are more than one possibility? Well, you should really use your imagination and try to think of other moves than the obvious one. Look at this position. It's an old joseki in which white saves the 4 stones by playing the kusumi, and you might feel inclined to immediately proceed by playing the sente exchanges against white's shape. But actually, the joseki follows with an extension by black. Why not play the free exchange? Actually, there are more moves that can be sente locally, and later they might be more useful than the obvious one. For example, this move is obviously sente. It threatens to capture white in a short ladder. And in fact, even this jump is sente against white's shape. So what is black's continuation? Black can play Atari, white connects, and now black's tiger's mouth captures white's chain of stones. And let me show you a more advanced example. Here is another classical joseki. The next move of black is this peep. White answers to capture black's stone, and you would feel inclined to keep on going and peep once more against white's shape. But actually, is it the only way of using white's weakness? Can you try to come up with at least one more sente move for black? Yeah, so actually, except for this move, black can also threaten to connect the stone with that kusumi, or with this attachment. And how could these other moves be useful? Well, imagine that later, white tries to develop the framework by playing the knight's move. If the exchange was in place, then apparently black doesn't have anything to do against white's shape. But if the options were kept open, then maybe now black can think of this attachment. White connects to capture the stone, and then black proceeds by cutting off the knight's move. White is in trouble. Why not make the exchange in the first place? Because if you keep more options open, your opponent's hands are tied. They cannot freely choose the shape because you can surprise them that you will choose this move or that other move. Deciding whether there is actually only one reasonable way to use the opponent's weakness can be sometimes a quite subtle question. Here is a famous example from the professional Go. This is the joseki, which humans played for centuries with this continuation of white, but in the game between Lee Sedol and AlphaGo, AlphaGo proceeded with the peep against the one-space jump. Lee Sedol answered, and then AlphaGo played elsewhere. This move surprised human players, and it used to be quite out of the radar of them because it's an peep against a one-space jump. We shouldn't really do it. We lose other possibilities of using the weakness. However, here, what are the other possibilities? Potentially, white could think of the peep from the other side, but this stone can be simply captured by the block. AlphaGo decided that the peep from the outside is the only reasonable way, and it's better to get it faster and strengthen the group. However, please note that if the position looked a bit different, it was moved by one line, then you would never see any AI or a human professional player continuing by this peep. This would be a terrible exchange because it destroys a lot of weakness that is there in black's corner. Instead, the correct move of white is to extend on the side. And then later, what can white do to use that weakness from the other side? There is this famous 3-3 invasion. Black usually descends and then white can continue by playing the peep and setting up a living group in black's corner. A premature peep from the outside could have eliminated this beautiful possibility. So be very careful. Play the sente exchange when you are really sure that you have no other way of using the weakness. And remember those basic examples when you can play the sente exchange without thinking. Peeping against the tiger's mouth, playing an Atari against it, or playing an Atari after a double hane.
By the way, you can also watch these lessons on our platform, gomagic.org. Except there, you'll watch them with interactive quizzes right within the lessons and practical exercises right after them. And if you enjoy watching these Go videos and you don't want to miss others like this one, go smash that like button, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and this is Go Magic.